Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Ron Plain analyzes how hog producers were able to record their first profitable month in almost a year. Lowell Sandell discusses glyphosate resistance in water hemp and giant ragweed. Jim Stack talks about plant biosecurity, and Tina Barrett outlines a few tips for tax preparations. The latest crop conditions report shows a slight improvement in both corn and soybeans. The ratings of both crops in good to excellent categories stands at 64%. Each up 1% from last week. For perspective, that's way above the same period a year ago. At this time in 2012, only 23% of corn and 29% of soybeans were listed as good or excellent. But in Nebraska, it could again be a case of have and have-nots. Corn that has irrigation is well above the average. 85% is listed as good or excellent. Corn in dryland situations, though, is labeled only 43% good or excellent, 19 points below the norm. So how big will this year's crop be? We'll learn more Monday when the USDA releases its latest crop production and supply and demand reports. Monday is also the day when we'll find out if the agency expects more soybean acres after resurveying 14 states which were late in planting. If the National Agricultural Statistics Service has data that justifies a change, it'll release updated estimates in the crop production report at 11 a.m. Central Time. University of Missouri Extension ag economist Ron Plain is our hog marketing analyst this week. While the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus continues to spread, the latest tally shows 16 positive states. Lower feed costs and the seasonality of the hog market have helped farmers accomplish something they haven't done in quite some time.
Hog producers are back in the black, turned a profit of about $11 per head sold during the month of June. First profitable month after 10 consecutive months of red ink.
So what went right there?
Well, a couple things. Seasonally, we tend to get high hog prices in the summer, and that's the case this year. We got prices above $100 per 100 pounds of carcass weight a number of days during the month. The other thing is feed costs have started to drop, and that's the bigger factor. Looks like we're going to have a fairly good harvest, and so cost of production for raising hogs is falling fast.
What's the break even look like right now, Ron?
Well, for June, Iowa State University calculations said 72 cents per pound of live weight. That's 95 cents per pound of carcass. It was down, as declined each month this year thus far, and good chance that it's going to continue to decline for the rest of the year.
A few weeks ago when corn and soybean markets, really soybean markets, were hit hard, soybean meal kind of led the way there. Both that and corn with the outlook of a big harvest, what does that do for input prices for the producer?
Well, it's rather remarkable how much lower things are right now. Here in early August, we're looking at the nearby December contract for corn, $3.50 a bushel lower than what the December 2012 contract was trading for. Bean meal prices also down sharply, so finally some production cost relief coming the way of hog farmers.
The porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, PEDV, is now in 16 states as of this taping. Is it widespread enough that you think it could have an impact on prices?
Probably so, Jeff. It's concentrated actually Iowa and Oklahoma have half of the cases, but still 16 states it's getting spread, and it's going to continue to spread. And yes, it's probably going to reduce fourth quarter hog slaughter by a short 1% in our estimation, which means probably 3%, maybe 4% higher prices in the fourth quarter than we'd had otherwise.
Does that spread to the meat counter then, Ron?
Well, yes, but not at that magnitude. Maybe 1.5% higher pork prices in grocery stores because of reduced production.
Give me your thoughts on where the U.S. economy stands and maybe how that relates to consumer confidence, consumer spending on pork products.
Yeah, consumers with money in their pockets are crucial, of course, to expenditures on meat. The economy seems to be slowly improving, but it's a very slow pace. We average less than 2% economic growth in the first quarter of this year. Unemployment, though, in July down to 7.4%. That's the lowest in a number of years. So hopefully we'll continue to see a stronger economy and stronger meat demand.
And abroad, what does it look like in the export scene?
Well, exports are a little bit soft. We're down in the first part of this year in pork exports compared to a year ago, but hopefully do better in the second half. China has been sharply lower on purchases. Russia's down a lot, and but the three biggest foreign buyers are Japan, Mexico, and Canada, and hopefully they'll continue to be steady buyers of U.S. pork.
Over the next month or so, what do you expect to see here for live hog prices?
Well, seasonally, we tend to see hog slaughter numbers pick up once we get past Labor Day and hog prices decline. So we'll probably hang on in the mid to upper 90s for several more weeks yet, but then see a pretty fast decline in prices as we move through September and into October.
And does the outlook show continued profitability then?
Yeah, if the futures market's right, we may have 12, maybe even 14 consecutive months of profit for hog producers ahead.
That's a big change from kind of how we started the year.
Yes, a huge change. During the 10 months of red ink, producers lost about $30 per hog sold on average, so I'm sure they're quite ready for some profits.
Next week, we'll look at the latest USDA crop production report, as well as corn and soybean markets with Wade Johannes from Central Valley Ag. In 2006, Mare's Tail became the first Nebraska wheat species to carry the label glyphosate resistant. Giant ragweed and kochia were confirmed as glyphosate resistant in 2011, and earlier this year, UNL researchers confirmed the presence of glyphosate resistant water hemp in 6 eastern Nebraska counties. At field days in David City and Fremont this week, producers had the opportunity to learn more about controlling these weeds, specifically water hemp and giant ragweed. Lowell Sandell talked with us in David City about the issues these two plants can cause and how you might be able to reduce them.
We've seen problems pop up in the last 3 to 4 years in Nebraska, particularly eastern Nebraska, with giant ragweed, and we just now have seen some more significant problems with water hemp. That's probably been our #1 question here this summer is water hemp, so we know those topics are on guys' minds.
What kind of yield hits can you take with those two weeds if you can't get them controlled?
Well, you know, the guys, there are certain problem fields out there that have tremendously high populations, and if they get away from guys, you know, you can almost zero out a yield because it's very difficult to get a combine through those areas. But you know, uncontrolled weeds can rob anywhere from probably 5 to 30% of potential yield out there.
This location is more focused on giant ragweed. Compare and contrast how easy it is or how difficult it is to control giant ragweed in corn versus in soybeans.
Yeah, giant ragweed comes up really early in the year, and that's the backdrop here at this David City site. The studies we've taken people through this year shows the challenges that producers face post-emergence in soybeans, but it also shows that we have good tools in corn that are very capable of controlling glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed.
But in soybeans, why is it more difficult?
Soybeans, it really takes a very strong pre-plant approach to giant ragweed control. Giant ragweed comes up very early in the growing season, and control prior to planting is the key for effective giant ragweed control.
What about in water hemp? What are the difficulties that you see there where you're working on that in the plot in Fremont?
Yeah, water hemp is just a whole nother animal. Really, it comes up much later in the growing season, will emerge from late spring all the way through summer. And water hemp, tank mixing products and getting control early on small plants is really critical when we're talking about glyphosate-resistant water hemp.
So really, in both of them, it's trying to manage it early before the planting. What if you find something that works? How long can that be reliable before you worry about building resistance again?
Well, that's one of the things we try to emphasize at these field days is a more integrated approach that is still manageable and relatively easy for growers to use. And all it comes down to is a good decision-making process on that, and selecting the right products for their farm for weed control that are going to be effective, yet mixing it up each year.
So those are the two we're looking at in these two field days this week in Fremont and David City. Are there other resistant issues that you're trying to take a look at as well?
Yeah, in the western part of the state, folks are pretty concerned about kochia, and that's a legitimate concern out there. Kochia is very much like giant ragweed. It comes up very early in the growing season, and good pre-plant management is critical to effective glyphosate-resistant kochia control as well.
Next week, we'll have more on resistance with Stephen Knezevic, who will discuss the background of weed resistance in Nebraska. The recent herbicide-resistant weed management field days in David City and Fremont were sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board. In June, the United Nations released updated world population estimates. Among the highlights, the world will grow from its current count of 7.2 billion people to 9.6 billion by 2050. India will surpass China as the most populous country around 2028. And Nigeria could contain more people than the U.S. by 2050. This obviously places agriculture in an important position. The UN already stated food production needed to double by the year 2050 to meet growing demand. Jim Stack specializes in diagnostics and disease management at Kansas State University. At a recent field day at the ARDC near Meade, we discuss why plant biosecurity and climate change are important factors in increasing food supply. But first, we asked why farmers in the U.S. and in Nebraska should notice the importance of meeting rising global food needs.
I would say the very obvious answer to that is that the United States is a very significant player in providing food to feed people in other countries. Nebraska is typical of a state in the Great Plains where we have the good fortune of being able to produce more than we need to satisfy our own population. The benefit that provides then is we can provide the food needs to other countries at the same time providing income to our population. So it's a very nice fit.
Let's talk about the challenges of getting there, of getting enough food and making it available. And the angle that we haven't talked a lot about is plant biosecurity and the infrastructure to make sure that as you mentioned today, the solution is the problem. More trade, but there's also a danger in more trade. And that danger is what? I mean, what is the issue with biosecurity?
Well, yeah, as you move plants and plant products around, whether it be the yield, the grain, or the plant parts themselves, you can't help but also move plant pathogens and insect pests, weeds in the seed. That just can't be helped. So you have to balance the benefit derived from shipping plants and plant products around the world with the risk inherent in shipping plants and plant products around the world. And one of those is the redistribution of pests and pathogens. So our challenge is to make sure that we have in place the infrastructure that allows us to intercept these organisms as we move them, but for those that slip through the systems we've put in place, to have the infrastructure that allows us to detect them quickly, figure out what we're dealing with, and respond accordingly so that we can keep their impact small.
Do we have that now?
We do to some extent. It can always be better. We've put in place a lot of practices in the last, say, 10, 15 years that are really showing a lot of benefit. Having said that, with the economic situation being what it is over the last 3, 4, or 5 years, we've decreased our investment in those systems that we need to protect us. That's a big deal because you can't recover very quickly from these incursions.
Specifically as it relates to plants, what's the danger in climate change and how it can affect a growing season, perhaps?
Well, we've already seen there's some significant research studies that we're looking at that show plant systems around the world are flowering 10 to 12 days earlier than historically they flowered. Significance of that is that they have co-evolved with the agencies that move pollen around, so insect vectors for a lot of pollen. Well, they've co-evolved to be in sync with those other parts of the system. And if all of a sudden they're flowering 10 to 12 days earlier, that puts the system out of sync. Not a good thing in terms of seed production or plant health. The other thing we've seen, and some very good studies on this, is because of the changes in the seasons, we've seen the geographic range of certain plant species start to change. So plants are growing further north than they did before. So the pathogens and the pests that they've co-evolved with, that's skewing now, and they're encountering new populations of the organisms that they've been accustomed to, and there'll be consequences of that. They will need to find a new equilibrium. So that's going to play out over the next few decades.
We know that the population is going to increase to 10, then to 11 billion by the end of the century. That's not really in question. I mean, you could, I guess, argue fertility based on which end it's going to be on, but the population is going to be there. So what's the answer to how do you solve it? What's the answer to these challenges?
Well, so first of all, the population models have been fairly accurate, so they're fairly dependable. And it would take something extraordinary that we can't even imagine right now to change the trajectory. So we will reach 9 billion by 2043. We'll reach 10 billion probably by 2080 or the end of the century, somewhere in that time frame. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. I have full confidence that we can do the science, we can develop the technologies necessary to feed 9 billion people. It will be a challenge. There are some significant hurdles. The water issue is enormous. Where is that water going to come from? Currently, globally, 75% of the fresh water goes to agriculture. Well, if we're going to increase production by 70%, that's going to take a lot more water. Water is also the basis of public health. Sanitation, the basis of public health, water, the basis of sanitation. So as we try to improve public health systems around the world, it's going to take more water. There will be competition for the very resources necessary to grow enough food. So we'll figure that out. It will take the minds of some really good people. It will take an adequate investment of public and private resource to accomplish that. We better wake up soon, though, or the consequences will be greater than they need to be.
Jim says public policy plays an enormous role in biosecurity because it sets the framework for decision making. You can hear that portion in our full interview on the Market Journal website. More than a year later, ranchers in Nebraska's Pine Ridge area are struggling to recover from devastating 2012 wildfires. You can read more about the damage suffered to grass, trees, and family ranching operations in the August Nebraska Farmer. UNL Extension educator Scott Cotton estimates more than 1,000 families were directly impacted by the fires, and between 600 to 1,000 miles of fence were destroyed. The fires left behind bald ridges where trees once dominated in this scenic region of the state. They nearly decimated whole sections of pine forest along Pine Ridge. You can read more details about the challenges ahead in the Pine Ridge area in the August Nebraska Farmer. In our previous show, Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business joined us to look at how narrowing margins in the grain market could affect producers. This week, Tina is with us again to look at tax preparations and new health care laws. The group of producers Tina works with saw a drop in net farm income for 2012, falling 8% from the record high levels in 2011.
Normally what we did, our history is we'd see a good year and a bad year, and we'd even out the tax liability right in between those, and we'd have inventories going up and inventories going down. Well, for the last 5 years, we've saw nothing but rapidly increasing inventories and tax deferral. And so we've got one bad year following 5 of the best years we've ever had. And so I think for a lot of producers out there, we can't change a whole lot on the tax situation as far as where we're planning to be, because we've got a lot of deferred tax liability to eat up.
Which means what? What would you recommend there?
Well, I think it's going to be really important for everybody to sit down and maybe look at their individual situation with their accountant, and maybe not just do what they've always done for tax planning and get to the exact same spot. They need to look at maybe changing their strategy, using up some of that inventories, getting some of that converted into cash before the end of the year. It's a tough thing to do because nobody wants to pay more taxes. But we got to think about what's best for the business as a whole and long term, and that might mean raising that tax liability up just a little bit.
Everything that went into effect at the beginning of the year when we did our 3-part series
Right.
trying to diagnose what was going on here, has everything kind of evened out now? Do you have a handle on everything? Do producers have a handle on it?
I think we've got, for the first time, we're looking at tax rates that we know what they're going to be, whether we like them or not. We know what they are, and that's at least something we can plan around. And that's a much better position than where we were a year ago. We've got estate tax nice and settled out, indexing for inflation. That's dealable. We can do some good estate planning with that. The only thing that's still up in the air is what they're going to do with depreciation. They didn't make that a permanent extension. They just extended the enhanced depreciation through 2013. So as we start 2014, we're still looking, just like we were a year ago, at no bonus depreciation and something around 30 or 40,000 of Section 179, which when we're comparing that to $500,000 of Section 179, it feels like we've got nothing.
As you start to look at the new health care law that's going to kick in, there's two differences here. The individual mandate would go in 2014, January 1,
Right.
but the business mandate would go in January 1, 2015. Is that accurate?
It is. And I think for most farms that we're talking about, we're looking at the individual mandate because the business's mandate is with those with 50 or more employees, and we don't see a whole lot of farms with that kind of hired help.
What would they need to do to get ready for this?
I think, if you've got health insurance, you're good to go. If you're not having health insurance, it's something that you've got to get in place because they're going to hit you with a tax on your tax return for every month that you don't have health insurance for 2014. And it's, of course, a complicated formula. It's not something simple. But, so it's just a matter of getting health insurance on board. And I believe the exchanges are supposed to be open by October 1st so that you can buy off of those if you don't want to go to a private health insurance company like we've done in the past.
Right. Now, the differences on how you earn your income will be taxed at a different rate as well?
That's right. So part of this health care bill was an additional Medicare tax. So on earned income, they're charging an extra 0.9% on any income over $250,000, and any unearned income, it's 3.8%. And really, what they're doing, we've paid a 2.9% Medicare tax, all along. So they're just taking both of them up to a 3.8%, and you're going to start to pay Medicare tax on unearned income, and that's rental income, interest, dividends, those kinds of things. Earned income would be wages, farm income, and that kind of stuff. Depending on what your business structure is, if you're structured as an S corp, you could potentially avoid some of that on both, and that's be one of the few places where it wouldn't touch either one. So
when would you like to see all this done by? Have farmers kind of have this in the ground by?
Oh, I think tax planning is an ever-changing thing from now until the end of the year. But I think it's time to start looking at what you want to do, so that as you go through harvest, whether you want to sell off the truck, whether you want to pay for those inputs as the dealers start coming around, that you know what you want to do, at least in a broad sense, before you get busy. And then it's time to fine-tune right through the end of the year.
Now, with this week's weather outlook, here's UNL Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a retrospective look at this last week. Scattered thunderstorms were almost a daily occurrence across the state. And unfortunately, the models didn't do a very good job in terms of the placement. We did see some locations that did see some beneficial rains. A lot of locations did not. The best locations for precipitation in this last 7-day period was north central Nebraska, northeast Nebraska, and portions of south central southwestern Nebraska, and a few isolated spots in the Panhandle. Once you moved east of these regions, very widely scattered thunderstorms with some hit and miss areas, nothing to up to a half an inch. The highest precipitation total during a 24-hour period in this last 7-day period was with a thunderstorm that moved through the O'Neill area, where over 4 inches of rainfall was recorded within a 24-hour period. Now, as we move to the south, this is where the real activity has been consistent. We've seen one thunderstorm complex after another move through Kansas, and in fact, if you look over this last 2 weeks, central Kansas through eastern Kansas has received anywhere from 8 to upwards of 15 inches of moisture during this period. So most of the drought signature has been gone in this region. In fact, in Nebraska, the drought signature, at least for the D4 conditions, has been removed from the sandhills, and we have seen some easing of conditions across portions of south central Nebraska, but we're starting to see an increase in the intensity across extreme eastern Nebraska. Do we have more moisture in the forecast? Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. And as we go to the models, you'll see that this persistent pattern of this trough of the Great Lakes and this ridge to our south, and of course the battle zone is between these two regions. So for today, we're looking at the storms running through around the periphery of this ridge, and that would take into consideration northeastern Nebraska as the best bet for thunderstorm activity, and some of that may sag down into east central Nebraska during the overnight hours. Now as we go into tomorrow, we'll see that ridge trying to push a little bit farther toward the north, so most of that activity will run through the Dakotas and Iowa with just a slight tendency to see some of that activity developing across northeastern Nebraska. As we go into Monday, we're going to try to see that ridge supplants itself a little bit farther to the south as this upper air trough tries to build backwards, and that means the main storm activity right now is designated across northern Kansas and also portions of southern Nebraska. This does look like to be the best widespread chance for precipitation statewide, and then as we go into the day on Tuesday, we'll see another piece of energy sagging from the southwestern part of the state through northeastern and east central Kansas. Some of that activity may make it into extreme southeastern Nebraska, but as we get to Wednesday, the ridge starts building in, and most of the activity, isolated nature, will be shunted into northeastern and eastern Nebraska, leaving a lot of western Nebraska high and dry. By the time we get to Thursday, the ridge stays in place, so the warm conditions remain in this region, and cooler conditions toward eastern Nebraska with just a slight chance of isolated thunderstorm activity. Then once again, as we get into Friday, not much change in that position, and it looks like most of the activity will remain in western Nebraska. So the temperatures will remain consistently in the upper 70s, low 80s across eastern Nebraska, upper 80s to low 90s across western Nebraska. In terms of the temperatures, below normal temperatures from next Thursday through the following Tuesday. In terms of precipitation, mostly above normal moisture moves to our east.
Thanks, Al. Our full interviews with Ron Plain, Lowell Sandell, Jim Stack, and Tina Barrett are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Wade Johannes will be our grain marketing analyst. Stephen Knezevic will discuss resistance issues in weeds, and we'll look at potential disease problems in weather-damaged corn. Soybean Management Field Days take place next week in Minden, York, Pierce, and Waterloo. You can find more information in last week's show and look for interviews from those events on our upcoming episodes. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.